problems. So we're going to look more here at just some of the problems that the American Army was facing at this time and just like who exactly was the Continental Army and everything. So the thing is, that whole Republican theory, it very much mistrusted professional armies because they saw these as basically an instrument of a tyrant. You don't need a professional army unless you need to keep everyone in line, and the only reason you need to keep everyone in line is if you're a tyrant. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you shouldn't need an army, is the idea. The other part of this idea with Republican theory was that, if an individual or community's rights were in danger, free men were just, supposed to grab their muskets, assemble into a local militia, take care of the problem, and then go home. Can you imagine if we tried to today fix all our problems in that way? The problems we would have. Just even looking at that, problems we could have like today and everything, but other problems with militiamen were, the thing is, militiamen are going to have trouble with coping with the shocking scenes of war because they're not steeled by habit or fortified by military pride. If you tomorrow just went to go fight off in a war, you or me would not be ready for that unless you have had training of some sort. And so oftentimes in battle, militiamen would prove to be unreliable. And so basically the American side had a choice. They either needed to develop a professional army or they were going to lose the war to Great Britain. So in the end, while state militias do continue to offer support, it's really the disciplined forces of the Continental Army that really win the crucial battles. But the Continental Army though. The thing is, the Continental Army is going to be tightened up by Washington. He is constantly going to prevail on Congress that they need to adopt stricter regulations, require enlistments of 3 years or for the duration of the war. Man, looking at that early fighting, there are so many times that Washington almost didn't have an army when they were going to fight Boston and everything because people would sign up for these terms of only a couple months and then they'd go home. And that was extremely problematic. Still, even as he finally gets his Continental Army over time, Washington is also going to use his militias very effectively. His consistent aim is just to turn this Continental Army into a disciplined fighting force so they could defeat the British in large engagements of massive massed troops basically. So the thing is, guerrilla fighting is what took place a lot early on, and we even saw that in Lexington and Concord. This would be shooting from trees. The thing is, this has its place, but it can never win a decisive formal battle. I mean, you can even look at more modern times with some of this with the Vietnam War, that there's an element of, there was a lot of guerrilla warfare against the American troops, and you would never say that, they were winning the war, but America could never defeat, the Viet Cong outright. And so guerrilla warfare is a great way to hold out for a long time, but to win a war, you need more than that. And especially at this time period, only a civilized victory, on the great battlefield would impress other European powers enough and, establish the legitimacy of the United States. And so it's very important that we have a disciplined fighting Continental Army. And to help with this, we are going to have Baron von Steuben. Now, technically, this was a new title for him, but he was an experienced soldier from the Prussian army. He actually lied on part of his application, so to speak, for the job. It's really fascinating if you get to look more into Baron von Steuben. But he was basically, the Prussian army at this time was continental Europe's best, and Prussia would be like a state within Germany kind of thing. He is basically going to become the Continental Army's drill master, and it's really thanks partly to him that Washington's troops are going to increasingly come to resemble the disciplined European counterparts that they are fighting against. But who are these men? Oftentimes, and this is looking at both the American side and the British side here for a moment, Oftentimes, they were of lower classes. Generally, they carried a brown Bess musket. This would be about 6 feet long when it had a bayonet attached, and it weighed over 16 pounds. And that was just the gun. Soldiers, usually in battle, were expected to stand close together in lines that were like 3 deep. They were expected to withstand bombardment without flinching, and then fire on command in volleys, and then eventually charge with the bayonet. Military life was extremely tough for these men. Seasoned troops would carry about 60-pound packs and normally cover about 15 miles a day, but they could go up to 30 miles in a forced march. Most weather conditions, like the British, are going to wear these heavy woolen uniforms that are dyed bright red for visibility in the smoke-filled battlefields. So think back to like that image that we looked at of like the Boston Massacre and all the smoke from the guns. And so the British wore these red coats, basically, so that they could know like where their fellow troops were. It wasn't supposed to be like putting a target on their back or anything like that. The other part of this is because they wore the red, they would oftentimes be known as the lobster backs as well. Frequently, we're going to see troops are going to be undernourished. Many die of disease rather than injury on the battle. Medical care is primitive. Treatments included like bleeding and purging. That'd be like, oh, cutting open part of yourself to bleed out a little bit so that you can get your humors in balance. Yeah, that doesn't work. Don't do that. Serious arm or leg wounds usually meant amputation without antiseptics or anesthetics, and oftentimes could prove to be fatal. Severe discipline is what holds these troops in line. For instance, if they struck an officer or deserted, that could bring death, and lesser offenses usually incurred some sort of beating. We are going to see after the winter of 1777 through 78, and I'm going to talk about that later a bit more, the Continental Army is going to really come to resemble those of the British Army. American recruits also tended to be low on the social scale. Continental soldiers frequently had little more than like maybe their shirts to cover their nakedness. They don't necessarily have the full uniform as often. And more than once, there's stories about like they would be marching barefoot through the snow and leaving like bloody footprints behind. The thing is, both sides are going to have a lot of trouble with supplying their troops during the war. Now, the British have plenty of money. The problem is they have to rely on supplies mostly being shipped from like the British Isles. Whereas the continental side, the American side, they don't necessarily have the money, and what they would use to pay for their supplies would be paper money that, as it's printed more and more throughout the war, the value of it just sinks considerably. We are going to see that occasionally Army officers, especially on the American side, would let this disgruntlement get out of hand. The most famous example of this is going to be Benedict Arnold, and you might recognize his name. His name today is synonymous with traitor, so you kind of know where this story is going to go. He had actually a really distinguished record for the first 3 years of the war, but then he felt treated shabbily by Congress, and so because of that, he is going to offer to surrender at a strategic point to the British, but before he could do so, basically the plot was discovered and he actually had to flee to the British side. Thus, today, if you call someone a Benedict Arnold, it's, calling them a traitor. The most serious part of Army discontent is actually going to occur after the war. This is in like New York. Basically, you get hot-headed young officers were concerned about being paid on time and what they were going to be paid and everything. And so they called for a meeting that could have led to some sort of armed uprising or military coup. But George Washington nips it basically in the bud through some sort of dramatic speech, basically warning the men of all they have to lose, but not just individually, but, the fate of the revolution and the honor of the army hanging in the balance. It is really questionable if those behind the conspiracy were really only bluffing and just, hot-headed and kind of like you might talk with your friends and stuff and then never go through with action on a particular, issue. I actually should also mention there were several There were actually quite a lot of American soldiers who would desert during the war. Generally, history kind of skates over them because there's this feeling of that we want to have this patriotism throughout all of the American Revolution, that, oh, everybody really was all for it, when the reality was that there were oftentimes people who could not handle continuing to be in the war and were fearful for their lives and did desert the army rather than continue on for the patriot cause. So, thinking about all of this, what do you think is the biggest problem the Americans faced during the American Revolution? Feel free to pause this and then make sure you go and answer it in your journal. What do you think is the biggest problem the Americans faced?